There's a kid's book called Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, I believe it is. Kid wakes up, there's gum in his hair, falls out of bed, he goes to school, there's problems on the way to school. His teacher doesn't appreciate his invisible castle project for his art class. His brother pushes him into a puddle of mud. He punches his brother back, but of course his mother didn't see his brother. He sees her or him punching his brother, so he gets in trouble. And then his least favorite meal, lima bean soup, is served at dinner, and he's just having a no good, terrible, kind of rotten day. And sometimes you and I have terrible, no good, horrible, rotten, very bad days. Maybe you've experienced some recently. Maybe you're going through it right now. And things snowball, one thing after another. And you're wondering how to get out from under it, how to get back to good. The poet and playwright Archibald MacLeish in 1958 did a play called J.B. after the character of Job in the Bible. And he says in his write-up about his play and why he wrote it, there's always somebody playing Job. There must be at least thousands, perhaps millions of humanity who are burned, crushed, broken, mutilated and slaughtered. For what? Innocent folks walking around in the world in the wrong skin, wrong-shaped noses or eyelids. This is again 1958 that he wrote it. Sleeping in the wrong night in the wrong city, whether London or Dresden or Hiroshima. And in these days, maybe we would say Kabul or Kursk or Port-au-Prince or Hendersonville. We've seen, he writes, Job everywhere, his children dead, his life work now for nothing, counting his losses, scraping his sores. There's always someone playing Job, feeling like Job, that her fate is undeserved and unjust, and then beginning to wonder, is it just fate, and is fate cruel? And if so, is God cruel too? No, we don't have to go very far to think about questions of suffering. As I mentioned and as we announced and as you've seen in countless, I'm sure, newsreels in Western Carolina and parts of Florida where houses and churches are, community centers are just underwater. Hundreds still missing. Everything that a family had built gone, including loss of life. Just like that. Or I imagine sometimes as I'm driving to the grocery store and I think about life and fairness, and I think it's a beautiful October day. This last couple of days have been gorgeous. And I think somewhere across the sea there are men and women and there are bombs dropping, and what were once cities in Kursk, in portions of Beirut and Israel and Gaza, places that were once thriving communities are now just rubble and ash. And I think, how is it that on the same day that I'm carefree, thinking about maybe going to, pick some apples or something, and at the same time people are worried if some shell's gonna fall and hit their children? How are these two things so worlds apart? Sometimes as a kid I thought about, how is it that I grew up in the family, just by the accident of birth, I grew up in the family I have, relative stability that we have, and some other kid grows up in a project somewhere with incredible instability. Just from their birth, as soon as they come into the world, the possibilities and probabilities don't seem like they're on a level playing field at all. I say, ask questions of why. Why is that? Sometimes I like to ask that of God, and I ask that in my prayer times. And if you are looking for the question of why, the question of why these terrible things happen to a good or blameless or upright person like Job, an innocent person like Job, somebody who is a good person, and you're wondering why these things happen, and you look to the book of Job and you want an answer, you're going to be disappointed. Because the book of Job, though I know there are a lot of sermons about why things happen to good people, an assumption that we're good all the time, which is a big assumption, by the way. That's not really what the book of wisdom of Job is about. It does raise those questions of why, but if you're looking for something satisfactory, as we often do in our demand society, where we just order something and it's at our doorstep and within 24 hours on our time frame, and we like things neatly packaged, the book of Job and its wisdom really doesn't go there. It asks the questions, it deals with anger, it calls God out, but really what the book of Job wants to know is, in this ancient culture, where if, according to my faith, I live a good, holy life, if I follow the commandments, if I obey God, if I'm faithful, the belief in ancient culture was then good things happen. We're blessed. Things will turn out for us well. If we do X, Y, and Z for God, then God will reward us and things will go well in our life. But life doesn't always go that way. And so the book of Job challenges that blessing and curses theology, and also asks the crucial question: if we're faithful and everything still falls apart, is God good? Is God just? Can I trust that God will be there when the wheels fall off the cart in my life? That's what the book of Job really wants to know. That's when his friends, his well-meaning friends, Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad, come and they say, they operate under the same assumption that Job does. If I do everything right, then God will be good to me. So Job's friends say, aha, Job, you must have done something wrong, whether you forgot it and you just didn't confess it, or you're hiding it from somebody and you're lying and you're really not as good as you say you are. But the fault's not with God, it's gotta be you. And so they go back and forth with this poetry, prose response throughout this beautiful book called Job. Now, how we read this book, and if this is a spoiler for the Bible study or the adult confirmation class on Wednesday, how we read the Bible, how we read this book really matters a lot. A lot of biblical commentators will say Job was a literal historical person, and they'll point to places like Ezekiel and James and say these other books in the canon speak to Job as being a person who holds on to his faith no matter what happens. He's dedicated and he's committed to his faith. See, he is a real person. He's a historical person. Now, I would say, not so fast. The counter-argument to that is threefold. First, the story sounds almost like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, we tell our fairy tales, but it says, there once was a time in the land of Uz that lived a man named Job. It sounds more like a hypothetical, but bear with me, there's some other reasons to think that it might be more of a metaphor or allegory in life to raise questions rather than a literal man's life. His name, Job, or Job as my daughter thinks it should be, in the confirmation class of 2 years ago, insisted that we call it the book of Job, not the book of Job. But anyway, his name means hated one or persecuted. But early in his life, everything is going swimmingly. I mean, he has donkeys and camels, and he has huge tracts of land, and he has sons and daughters. And so everything's going well. He's blameless. God calls him blameless. So why would anybody call him hated unless his name is a play on what is going to happen to him? And then the third point I would make, which is really the most difficult part of the book of Job, in my opinion, is how God is portrayed. So let me break it down for you in as Amy read, the accuser or the Satan comes, part of the heavenly hosts, God is talking to the heavenly host and says, hey, everybody, have you considered my servant Job? He is a dandy. I mean, if it was Dick Vitale, he'd say, he's a diaper dandy, baby. He's great. He's fantastic. He is a blameless, upright, righteous person. There's nobody like Job. And the Satan says, yeah, you know what, though? It's just because you coddle this guy. You bless him all the time. You mess with him a little bit. Let me throw a little calamity his way. Let's see how he deals. How about a little fire, Scarecrow? Give him a little adversity and see what happens. And God says, I'll take that bet. You're going to regret. That's Charlie Daniels. But the idea that God plays like a chess match between Professor X and Magneto, that God plays with the fates and makes bets about the fates of people, if we take that literally, do we really believe that God is that fickle, rolling the dice with our lives, and by the way, with the lives of others around us to win a bet, a divinely bet as it is? Or again, is this more an allegory to set up around the questions that will later be probed in the book of Job on what happens when things that you don't deserve happen to you in your life, and they're crushing, and you ask the question of God, why is this happening? Will God still be there? Will God still show up? Can God be counted on and trusted? That's really where the bread and butter of this text is. And so Job, throughout this back and forth with his friends, he's with his wife. I mean, he has a horrible day, right? His camels are taken, his donkeys are stolen, his servants, again, another case against the literal. All his servants die in every case except for one that comes back to tell him how rotten everything is that happens to him. And then, in the midst of all of that, there's a windstorm that collapses the house that his sons and daughters are eating in, and all of his family, save his wife, who's very helpful, again, marriage counseling book maybe, just curse God and die already. Oh, well, a happy marriage the two of them must have had. But she expresses, she's kind of the foil in the story, right? Just give up your faith. The same thing that the Satan says. Just throw in the towel. He'll fold, his faith will fold like a house of cards if he's pushed to the limits and everything around him starts to collapse. And at the heart of it, the book of Job says that God believes, despite all the evidence to the contrary, God believes that humanity is worth being in relationship with. Despite all the times when we might fold the cards or do things that are way outside the realm, in this case, Job is blameless. God says he's good. God says he believes in Job's goodness, whereas in this case, the accuser says, no, there's no reason to believe in that, because ultimately every person has their breaking point, and he will fold. So, this book, a series of 3 sermons that will speak to this book, ends with Job demanding to hold court with God. He gives up on his friends' counsel. They're not helpful in the moment. And he says, God, I want you to come on down here. I'll represent myself in the defense. You come on down here and tell me what I've done to deserve all this that's happened to me. Because as far as I can see, I've done nothing to deserve it. And God shows up in this whirlwind, appropriately, in the storm. And in a nutshell, without spoiling too much of future sermons, God says, hey, Do you know the predatory habits of lions? Were you there when I formed creation and the stars? Do you know about all the depths of the ocean? Basically, God says, hey, our relationship is disproportionate. I am creator, you are created. There are some things you're not going to know. There's some things you might not be able to handle. You've made the assumption, Job and Job's friends, that based on your perspective as a human being, you understand my perspective as God. It's kind of, if you've seen the movie Bruce Almighty, you think he can do it better, Bruce? Have at it. I'll take the day off. And Job realizes that as a human being, he has made some assumptions about God, and maybe he is in a little over his head. We'll talk about the end of the book more later, so that's going to be continued. But the thing that really strikes me about this book in this moment, as we're talking about World Communion Sunday, as we think about the things in our world that feel so broken, I mean, it's not hard to see human suffering. It's not hard to see the pain of innocence and people who are victims of things more powerful than they had any say in. And the thing that strikes me most powerfully is that God doesn't stand off, say mea culpa. God steps into the storm and the questions of life and says, yes, you can count on me to be here. There's nothing that's going to happen in this life that I'm going to walk away from you. There might be things, you might not be able to always answer the questions of why in this earthly life, but you can answer the question that you can trust me to be good to you and to never abandon you. And you can be angry as Job is angry and furious with God. You can shout to the moon against God. You can ask God the toughest of questions, and God doesn't say, no, you're fired. I want nothing to do with you. No, God shows up because God thinks and believes at the heart of this text that unlike what the accuser says, that we're worth it. That in the end, God believes in the human relationship with the divine. God won't give up on it, no matter every reason we might give God in our cruelest and most violent moments. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Amen.